Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. I hope you guys are all doing fine. Anyway, I saw this tie on Instagram and it was going for 20,000 naira thereabouts. And the moment I saw it, it just reminded me of the importance of knowing how to sew your own clothes. I immediately went to the market and got the fabric. I actually got this fabric for 8,000 naira per yard. I used 3 yards for this style. So that means I spent 3,000 naira for the fabric. I also got 50 naira thread and 50 naira zipper. Basically, I ended up spending 3,100 to sew this dress, aside the pattern paper, which is 100 naira. So if I want to sum it up, let's say I used 3,200 naira for this dress. So yeah, that's the benefit of sewing your own clothes. Anyways, enough of that. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, I don't know what you're waiting for. Please hit that subscribe button. And with that being said, let's get started. The first thing we're going to be doing is to mark our chest line, our bust line, our waistline, and our hip line. I'm going to mark it and then I'll draw a straight line like so. And then from the top line, I'm going to be marking half of my shoulder measurements and I'll connect it to the chest line. And then after doing that, I'm going to go down by 1 inch from that line. And then on the top line, I'm going to be marking 3 inch for my neck width. And then I'll connect. And then from this point, I'm going to be dividing this line by 2 and I'll go in by 0.5 inch. And then on the chest line, I'm going to be marking quarter of my bust measurements. And I'll use a French curve to connect these 3 points like so. And then after doing this, I'm also going to be marking for the back armhole because we are drafting for both the front and the back. And then from this line, I'm going to go down by 4 inch. That is where I want my neckline to start from. You can go down by 5 inch if you want. And then on the waistline, I'll mark quarter of my waist measurements. While on the hip line, I'll mark quarter of my hip measurements. Take note, I'm not adding any darts to this pattern. Hence, I'm drafting a dartless pattern. So I'm going to use my rule to connect from the chest line to the waistline down to the hip line like so. Also remember to add your 1.5 inch sewing allowance on all points and you connect it. So when you're done with this, the next thing to do now is to create that box effect that we have from the waistline down to the hip line. I'm going to be using a French curve to do this. You can use a ruler if you want. And then from that waistline, I'm going to be marking 4 inches away from it. That is how low I want it to be. You can use 4.5, but I ended up using 4 inches. So I'm going to be using the French curve to connect it. Also, like I said, you can use a ruler to connect it if you want it to be straight. But for this tutorial, I'm going to be using a French curve because I want it to be a little bit curved. So I'm going to just use a French curve and connect it all the way to the side seam. And then now I'm just going to cut it off. When you're done cutting, you're going to separate the back from the front. You're going to cut off that zipper allowance from the front, while the back you're going to leave it as it is. And then onto the bodice, we are going to be cutting it like so. Remember to add half an inch sewing allowance to the shoulder line. When you're done, you're going to be keeping the back pattern aside. And then for the front pattern, I'm going to be marking my 2 inches wide band that I added for this dress. So when I mark that 2 inches, I'm going to connect it from one point all the way to the next. And then also remember to cut off the zipper allowance that we added while drafting the pattern. And then also cut off the armhole for the back so that we can have the front pattern. And then when you're done with this, the next thing to do now is to divide our shoulder line by 2. And then after dividing it by 2, I'm going to connect it to the neckline that we drew earlier. And after connecting it, all you have to do now is to cut the neckline. And so that will be all for the front pattern. So you're going to place this on the fabric and you're going to be cutting. While for the back pattern, I'm going to be drawing out the shoulder line on the back, and then I'm also going to be marking my 4 inches neckline point, just like we did in the front. You can make yours to be 2 inches or less depending on what you want. And then from this point, I'm also going to be dividing my shoulder line by 2, and then I'll connect it to the neckline. And then remember to draw out the zipper allowance, because we'll be having a zip at the back, so I'm going to be drawing out that point as well. And then from this point now, I'm going to be going in by 0.5 inch. This is just to help me to remove any bulkiness at the back. Then I'll cut it off. Then I'm also going to be drawing out my sewing allowance on the side seam. Then I'll cut off the neckline for the back. And that will be all for the back pattern. You're also going to be placing this on the fabric and you're going to cut. So this is the fabric that I use for this dress. Here I have 3 yards of a lightweight floral crepe fabric. And what I did is to place the fabric on fold, and I'll place my pattern on it and I'll cut. So the first thing I did was to cut for the band and for the middle part of the front pattern. So after cutting it, I'm going to be removing the band pattern from the fabric, and then I'll tape it back to the original front pattern, and I'll use that pattern to cut on the fabric like so. And then remember to add your sewing allowance to the waistline and to the neckline. I've also added sewing allowance to the other pattern as well. And then from here, I'm going to be removing the pattern from the fabric, and by the time you open it up, this is what it should look like. So I've also gone ahead to cut the lining for this dress. For the lining, I cut exactly what I have for the main fabric, just that I did not cut all the way down to the waistline. So now I'm just going to join the fabric to the lining. I'll pin it at the neckline, and I'm going to sew using 1/2 inch sewing allowance. So by the time you're done sewing, you're going to be notching it like I am showing you now. So the importance of this notching is so that it can be able to open up when we want to turn it to the right side. So now you're going to take it to the sewing machine and you're going to do an understitch. And by the time you're done and you press it, this is what it should look like. So I've also gone ahead to hem the down part of the front pattern. And by the time you turn it to the wrong side, this is what it should look like. So now the next thing to do now is to go ahead and cut a piece of fabric that is about 3 inches wide. The length of it should be longer than our front pattern. It should be longer by 0.5 inch on both sides, so that by the time you fold it in, it should be equal length. So I'm going to take it to the pressing iron. I'm going to be folding it on all sides by 0.5 inch inward. So you secure it with a pin and then you place it on the fabric like so. So now then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I'm placing it at the middle of the front pattern. Then when you are sure it's at the middle, you are going to pin it down. After pinning it down, I'm going to be taking it to the sewing machine and I'll be sewing close to the edge like so. By the time you're done and you open it, this is what it should look like. So now I'll turn it to the right side and I'm going to be sewing 1/2 inch away from the line twice. So by the time you're done and you face it to the right side, the wrong side, this is what it should look like. Just make sure that your lines are straight and clean. So the next thing to do now is to cut the rope that we're going to be using for the drawstring. I'm using the main fabric as the rope, I just cut a piece of fabric and then I folded it and sew on it, and then I turn it to the right side. So the length of the rope should be longer than the front pattern. Just depends on how long you want it to be. So now what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using a bobbin pin. I will attach it to the rope that we made, and then I'm going to pass the rope through the hole that we created. So when we reach the waistline of the bodice, I'm going to be joining the rope to the fabric at the neckline, making sure that I secure it in place at that point. And then I'm also going to do the same thing for the other side as well. And this is what it should look like. So by the time you draw it, you should have something like this. So the next thing to do now is to focus on the band and the middle part of the dress. So for the band, I've gone ahead to cut 2 pieces of the band, and I'm going to open it up like this, place 1 piece on the other, and I'm going to be sewing the longer part of the band using 0.5 inch sewing allowance. So by the time you turn it to the right side and you understitch it, this is what it should look like. I've also gone ahead to iron the 0.5 inch allowance inward. So now I'm also going to be removing the pattern from the middle part of the front, and by the time you open it up, this is what it should look like. So I'm going to be attaching the band to the middle part of the front pattern. So I'm going to be sewing it in place like so, and this is what it should look like. So when you're done with that, we are going to be attaching the bodice to the middle part of the dress at the waistline. So just make sure you align everything and you attach it to the waistline. So take note that the bodice is covering the band of the middle part of the dress. So for the back pattern, I've also gone ahead to cut on the fabric, and I added 1/2 inch sewing allowance to the waistline and to the neckline. So by the time you're done cutting, you're going to be removing the pattern from the fabric, and you're going to be opening it up, and this is what it should look like. I've also gone ahead to cut the lining for the back as well, and just like the front, I did not cut the lining all the way to the down part. So I'm going to be arranging it like so. Then I'll pin it down, and I'll sew using 1/2 inch sewing allowance at the neckline. So by the time you're done sewing and you turn it to the right side, this is what you should have. So now the next thing to do is to also remove the pattern from the middle part of the back. And when you open it up, this is what it should look like. So now I'm going to be joining the middle part of the back pattern to the bodice like so. So I'll use 1/2 inch sewing allowance to join both sides together. So by the time you're done, this is what you should have. So now the next thing to do is to attach the zip to this dress. I'm using an invincible zipper for this. So I'm going to be attaching it from the neckline all the way to the hip line, from about 1 inch away from the hip line. So by the time you're done attaching the zip, this is what it should look like. So now the next thing to do now is to join the middle part of the front to the middle part of the back like so. I'm going to be closing the zipper allowance on the back pattern. I'm just going to arrange it the way it is, and then from this point I'm going to be measuring it from one side seam to the next. I'm about to cut the down part of the dress, which is the gathers part, and I need this measurement to be able to know how wide the fabric is going to be. So right now I got 22 inches, so I'm going to be timesing 22 inches by 2.5 inches, and with that I'm going to know how wide the fabric is going to be. So 22 inches by 2.5 is 55 inches. So that means the width of this fabric is 55 inches. You can times it by 3 or by 2, depending on how full you want the gathers to be. when you're done with that, the next thing to do is to determine how long the down part of the dress is going to be. The length of the dress that I want is 42 inches. So I'm going to be subtracting 25 inches from 42 inches. The 25 inches is the distance from my shoulder all the way to my hip line. So 25 inches, 42 inches minus 25 inches is about 17 inches. So I'm also going to be adding 1.5 inch sewing allowance to the 17 inches. So that means the length of the down part of the dress will be 18.5 inches. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and I'm going to be hemming the down part of the dress like so. While for the top part of the fabric, I'm going to be running a gather stitch. So I've gone ahead to hem the down part and I've also gone ahead to run the gather stitch. So now I'm going to be gathering it up like so. So I'll gather it to until I get back that 22 inches that we marked out earlier. By the time you get back the 22 inches, you're going to be joining the down part to the dress like so. So make sure that the gathers is evenly spread on all sides. And then you're going to be starting the gathers from about 1.5 inches away from the side seam. So you're going to join it like so, and then pin it down and you sew using 1/2 inch sewing allowance. By the time you turn it to the right side, this is what it should look like. I'm also going to do the same thing for the back pattern as well. And then when you're done with that, you're going to be joining the back to the front at the shoulder line. So make sure that you are joining the fabric to the fabric and the lining to the lining by opening it up and arranging it like so. So when you're done joining it at the shoulder line, you're also going to be joining it at the side seam from the armhole all the way to the waistline down to the hemline of the dress. So when you're joining the front to the back, you're going to be making sure that the waistline of the front is aligning to the waistline of the back. The hip line of the front is also aligned to the hip line of the back, and the hemline as well. Make sure everything is aligned. So when you're done pinning it down, you're also going to do the same thing for the other side as well. And when you're done sewing, this is what it should look like. So at this point now, all we have to do now is to cut the sleeve for this dress. And to do that, I'm going to be placing my fabric on fold like so. The length of it is 23 inches long. That's how long I want it to be. While how wide the fabric is about 11 inches. So the next thing to do now is to divide your bust measurement by 12. Whatever you get, you're going to be adding 1.5 inches to it. So my bust measurement is 33 divided by 12 is about 4 inches. So I'm going to be adding 1 inch to it for sewing allowance. That is, I'm cutting about 5 inches. So I'm marking 5 inches away from the top of the fabric. So the next thing to do is to measure from the shoulder line on this pattern, on the back pattern, all the way to the chest line. I got 7 inches, so I'm going to be marking 7 inches on the fabric. So I'm also going to add 1.5 inch sewing allowance to it. And then from this point, I'm going to connect it to the top of the fabric, like so. While for the down part of the sleeve, I'm going to be marking out 11 inches wide. Just depends on how full you want the sleeve to be. So after marking it, I'm going to be connecting it all the way down like so, and then I'll cut it off. So after cutting it and you open it up, this is what it should look like. For the front pattern, for the front part of the sleeve, I'm going to be going in by 0.5 inch like so. And then the next thing to do is to hem the down part of the sleeve. So when you're done hemming it, I'm going to be passing the elastic band through it. The length of this elastic is 8 inches. So I'm going to be using a bobbin pin, and then I'll pass it through the hole that we created while hemming it, and then I will join it at the side seam all the way down like so. So by the time you're done with this, you're going to turn it to the right side, and then you attach it to this, and then you attach it to the dress. And that will be all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.